Que tengo un buen dia, senor. I am Captain Hornigold, and this is my crew. We're sailors like yourselves, but quite unalike in our purpose. For we intend to take all that you own. Yet no harm shall befall any man so long as he remains at ease. Is that clear?
No me mate, señor. Tengo familia. Se lo suplico.
Anyone speak English? English?
Little bit.
Tell your friends we're stealing your goods, and we won't hurt nobody if everyone stays as still as a sandbar. You got that?
Please to repeat.
Oh, for fuck's sake. Lock him in the hold, and take everything that isn't nailed down.
We already discussed how piracy in the Caribbean came to be, but we didn't really touch on the why. As mentioned last episode, during the 17th and 18th century, seaborne trade exploded and became a draw for many merchants. That said, why did many men choose to turn to illegal piracy when there was so much legitimate trade going on? To further understand this draw, we need to address some misconceptions. Pirates were generally considered truly free men, and that is why sailors turned to a life of piracy.
We're prosperous and free and out the reach of kings, clergy, and debt collectors.
The surplus of sailors at the time allowed merchants to drive wages down and cut corners. Working conditions were awful. Merchant sailor crews suffered from mortality rates as high or higher than the slaves they were transporting. As for the Navy, it was a common practice for them to kidnap sailors from the shore and force them into serving on a ship. Sometimes they grabbed men who were drunkenly passed out, only to have them wake up at sea and handed a mop. It's easy to see why piracy seemed like a good idea to these men. Now I hear you say, but wasn't it even worse serving on a pirate ship? What with the tyrant captains and bloodthirsty crews? Well, no. They were not rowdy, peg-leg-toting brutes aboard a ship. Quite the contrary. While at sea, they, like all other sailors, were at work and were expected to act as such. So it makes sense that most pirates were pretty average men of the era. In fact, many were educated or specially skilled men. Surgeons, cooks, and carpenters were always needed on board. And in particularly rare cases, they weren't even men at all, such as Mary Read and Anne Bonny. They also didn't make their prisoners walk the plank. There are no records of that ever happening. If they did have prisoners, they were often thrown overboard with very little ceremony. And another thing, they didn't talk with a ridiculous pirate accent. There's really no such thing.
Arr, yar, matey.
It comes from the West Country accent from the southwestern portion of England, but it was likely brought to the public eye with actor Robert Newton. He overdid it with the R's while playing Long John Silver in Disney's Treasure Island. He then did it again when playing Blackbeard 2 years later, and the stereotype was born. I mean, if you really think about it, it makes no sense that there would be a pirate accent. They were multicultural. There were pirates from all the colonial nations: English, French, Spanish, Dutch, you name it. Hell, even the famous corsair Redbeard, or Barbarossa, was Mediterranean. He never set foot in the Caribbean.
Not that twaddle again, can we? It's a story for schoolboys.
Okay, so they weren't bloodthirsty, but they were certainly lawless anarchists, right? Not at all. Pirates were actually far more progressive for their time than we give them credit for. They were often bound by an Articles of Agreement or a pirate's code. It was a lot like their own constitution applying to their ship as if it were its own little nation. Every crew member was expected to sign the articles, then swear an oath of allegiance or honor. Oath was sometimes sworn on a Bible, but John Philip's men, lacking a Bible, swore on an axe. Several other weapons or tools were recorded as being used during this swearing in as well. Now, this practice officially inducted the signer into the crew, giving him the benefits described in the code itself. And many pirate codes offered equal shares of loot among the crew, though officers received more. Captains and quartermasters received 2 shares. The master, boatswain, and gunner received 1.5 shares, and other officers received 1.25. Crew members were expected to do their share of duties and keep their equipment in working order. However, certain acts were outlawed while on a ship, such as stealing or gambling. Anything that might lead to fighting or disagreements between men was generally frowned upon. This is why the idea that a woman on board a vessel was considered bad luck, not because of any strange superstition, but because it could potentially cause men to fight over her. What is surprising is that they were also sometimes offered an insurance plan of sorts should they lose limbs in combat. They received a certain payment depending on the severity of the injury, and were dropped off in port to live a more peaceful life if necessary. And it wasn't a small sum either. Sometimes it was enough for them to start their own businesses. Pirate ships were also often democratic. Captains were voted in and out and could rarely make decisions without the agreement of the crew.
You've a knack for this kind of work.
It ain't work if you love it.
Fudge.
Alright, so what about the flag? Okay, you got me there. While there was no pirate accent, there was a pirate flag, the Jolly Roger. That said, they were not always the traditional skull and crossbones that we've come to expect. At first, they simply used solid black or red colored flags that each held very specific meanings. The idea was that a black flag would cause their prey to panic and surrender before any violence was necessary. If the ship resisted, then the pirates would replace the black flag for a red or a blood-stained one. A black flag meant that the pirates would give quarter to their prisoners, but fighting under a red flag meant that they would show no mercy. It was very important for their prey to know that they were pirates, not a privateer or a government vessel. The reason for this is that pirates did not have to abide by a rule that if a crew resisted, it could not be executed. Pirates could do whatever they want with their prisoners. The Jolly Roger as we know it would come into use later, and even then there were many different designs. Pirate captains often designed their own individual flags in the early 18th century. Eventually, the diverse symbols were replaced by the standard skull and crossbone design, and they really weren't that fancy. The only Jolly Roger that still exists is actually pretty underwhelming. Pirates didn't use the Jolly Roger all the time. It wasn't a flag of their own individual nation like it's kind of portrayed in Assassin's Creed 4.
So let the black flag signal nothing but your allegiance to man's natural freedoms.
They would often fly false colors or no colors at all until their prey was visible. It was actually a very bad idea to openly display a Jolly Roger. Merely possessing one was considered proof of being a criminal pirate and pretty much set you up for execution if you were caught. This made it a good idea for pirate ships to be small and agile, for hit-and-run tactics, and to escape the law. They were rarely intimidating ships and were never really built for war, with at least one notable exception.
She's a fussock, she is. Fat and slow.
Finally, one last bubble to burst about pirates and their treasure. They didn't bury it, and they certainly never drew maps to find it again. In fact, there's only one recorded incident of a pirate ever burying treasure, and that was William Kidd. But he never drew any maps, and the treasure was removed shortly after as evidence in his trial. However, this legend inspired storytellers, and the myth was popularized by 3 stories. The short story Wolfert Weber by Washington Irving, The Gold Bug by Edgar Allan Poe, and of course, Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson.
Oh, rot. It's fairy stories you prefer to gold, is it?
It's worth more than gold, Thatch.
So now that we have a clearer image of what piracy was like during the era, I think it's time to take a closer look at some of the individuals. But we'll be doing that next time.